Hi everyone, this is Mary and this is part 6, the last part of our marriage class. You'll notice that I do not have Andrew with me tonight. He actually had to stay over from work, so he is not here. But I still wanted to have our class this evening and he kind of gave me the okay to still have it. I hope this has been helpful to you. I know that it has really been helpful to us as a couple. Tonight we're going to talk about intimacy. So I wanted to start a little bit earlier today because I know that we have Father Freedy this evening at 7 presenting. So I wanted to make sure that to get this in so that later on tonight you could just hop on here and it would already be available to you. Or you could watch tomorrow as well. I'll make sure to upload this on YouTube after the weekend. So let's talk a little bit about intimacy in marriage. So there's different forms of intimacy. This is so important because a lot of couples don't talk about this prior to marriage. So first, let's talk a little bit about happiness, because all of us want to be happy. I don't know anyone that doesn't want to be happy. So what brings you happiness? Think about the things that make you happy. When you think of the culture's view of happiness, you might think of things that bring you pleasure. So let's discuss a little bit about authentic happiness, which is God's view, joy, and the culture's view, which is pleasure. Does God want you to be happy? All right, that's an open-ended question. Do you think that God wants you to be happy? And what proof can you see around you to prove this point? So let's discuss first the culture's view. When you think about something that's happy, you think about pleasure. Does God want you to experience pleasure in this life? Yes. God wants you to experience much pleasure in this life, but in the right context. Okay, so pleasure is not sustained beyond the activity producing it. Basically, that means that physical pleasure is fleeting and it can detach. And when we detach it from our essential purpose in life, it leaves us feeling empty in the aftermath. So, for example, when I eat pizza, I cannot sustain the pleasure that I have by eating pizza after I've already eaten the pizza. Just this morning, my daughter ate an egg, sausage, and cheese sandwich, and she enjoyed it. And then as soon as it was done, she said, "Oh, I miss it." How many of us can relate to that? Okay, so you're happy while you're eating that food, but then afterward, because that pleasure cannot be sustained beyond that activity, what do you need to do? You need to either eat more, or you get sick from eating too much, right? All right, so examples of things that bring us pleasure are things like food, alcohol, or social media, sex. These things can give us pleasure for a time, all right? But they're fleeting. The happiness involved with them can only be sustained while we're doing that activity. So God wants us to experience this pleasure. So let's talk about a little bit about authentic happiness. The only experience intimacy, authentic, true happiness, to the extent that you're willing to reveal yourself, meaning give of yourself. So when most people have an addiction of any kind, and this doesn't have to be drugs, but people are addicted to things like food, alcohol, their phones, pornography, they're born by a lack of intimacy. So if you struggle with any kind of addiction, whatever it is, it stems from a lack of intimacy in our lives. Basically, you're trying to fill the void. This needs fed. So you're willing to fill the void with destructive ways or unhealthy ways, such as sexual experiences, which is, the result is a growing emptiness, basically. So you're happy at the time, and then afterwards you still feel empty. Intimacy draws us out of ourselves, right? Out of our self-centered imaginary world of self-absorption into a real experience of others. True, authentic intimacy is supposed to do that. So genuine intimacy comes to liberate us from loneliness instead of contribute to the growing emptiness that a lot of people have. So there's several ways that God has given us to experience intimacy. All right. So intimacy is not bad. Pleasure is not bad. Do not hear me saying that. However, God wants us to experience much pleasure in this life in the right context. So intimacy, this is the process of self-revelation that inspires us to give of ourselves completely to another in love. That is what God has planned as far as intimacy. We're supposed to not be thinking about what I'm getting out of it, but what I am giving. You're emptying yourself for the other. And we reveal who we are. Relationships are also part of this process. So too often we try to hide our true selves. We yearn for intimacy, but we avoid it. How often have you been in a relationship where you keep showing parts of yourselves, and then as soon as it starts getting real and you start seeing or showing parts of yourself to the other person that is, less than perfect, you get nervous about revealing that part of yourself to the person. So at a deep level, we sense that we have a profound need for intimacy, but we avoid it. We get scared. We shut down. We build walls around our hearts because we're nervous about getting rejected. Maybe you have issues with rejection or with abandonment or something like that, some kind of trust issues, and you're not able to open yourself up to someone. Intimacy exposes our secrets. We have to be vulnerable, basically, to have this intimacy. It requires 100% trust, and we have to share every aspect of yourself with that other person. And you have to allow another to see you for who you truly are, your strengths and your weaknesses. So in the perfect form, intimacy requires a complete and unrestricted sharing of self. That's what God wants us to achieve through this intimacy. Without intimacy, we're left wanting. Wanting what? More intimacy. Our desire for happiness is ultimately a desire for intimacy. So think of the happiest people you know. Okay. Those people are thriving. Do they just have sex for the sake of having sex? No. Or do they have some kind of deep intimacy in their lives? They might have sexual experiences too, but the foundation of their lives, including sex, is an authentic experience of intimacy. Having people that they share their lives with, a genuine interest in others, great relationships. We can't be loved for who we are until we reveal ourselves. Unrevealed, we may never experience the joy God has in store for us. All right. So if you're feeling unhappy, you're lacking intimacy somewhere, and it's up to us to discover where we're lacking in there. So God created the sexual act, and therefore we can argue that it is good. All right. So sex can equal love. God wants us to be happy forever because God is love. How can something that's pleasurable like sex give us lasting happiness? Only when it helps us to become the best version of ourselves. Okay. Now we could argue that sexuality, sex, the pleasure of sex is fun. It is fun, but fun does not equal happiness. Fun is important, for a healthy life in the right context, but sex does not always equal intimacy. All right. It does not always equal intimacy. Those are two different things. The act of sex itself may or may not also include intimacy. It could be a part of intimacy. It doesn't equal intimacy because sex doesn't always come with a guarantee of intimacy. All right. So let's talk about a little bit. We're going to lead this into marriage and how this kind of relates. Do you want to be happy? Of course. How can you be? Intimacy. All right. Becoming the best version of yourself. So what is God's plan for you, especially in your vocation of marriage? And how can you have this deep joy in intimacy? Because it's the one thing that we cannot live without. What is intimacy? Intimacy is self-revelation. So let's talk about the different forms of intimacy. The first one is physical intimacy. So that would be things like sexual intercourse, where the two become one. Uniting is significantly easier than separating. So this explains the pain that people feel after separating with someone that they've been sexually active with. So, if you have, say, several partners over your life, sexual partners, you leave a piece of yourself with every sexual encounter that you've had. And it creates a sense of being pulled in different directions. So basically yourself is being torn into pieces, whether you think so or not. Because sexuality is a lot more than just physical. So God created the a sexual intimacy in the bonds of marriage, because in that holy bond, you can completely surrender and be your true authentic self for someone, and you're able to come together without the fear of separating. And so because of that, you're able to be vulnerable and share your entire self. It's an act of self-emptying love in the best form. Let's talk a little bit about emotional intimacy. So emotional intimacy is a lot harder to achieve because you have to be very vulnerable. You have to let your guard down. And this takes a lot of time. A lot of times people struggle with being emotionally intimate, especially men, because men aren't as emotional as women. And sometimes men are emotional, but they don't even know how to verbalize the emotions that they have. And so because of that, it takes a lot of time for a man in particular to feel safe with someone, especially with a woman, to be able to share his thoughts and his feelings, things that he struggles with, his weaknesses. Men don't want to appear weak because they want to be a provider and they want to take care of. Whereas women, we're nurturers. We talk about our emotions, and we have a lot of emotions. And so because of that, we're more free to share those emotions with other people a lot of times, unless we've been hurt. A lot of times women that have been hurt in the past, they block off those emotional parts of themselves to their husband because they're afraid of, if I show so much of myself, they're not going to love me anymore. And it's very sad when that occurs. I know for myself, I had a lot of emotional wounds. And it took me a long time in my marriage to trust my husband fully with all of myself, that he was not going to leave me. He was not going to hurt me. And that I could trust him with things. I could talk to him about anything and not have to be afraid that he would leave or reject me in any way. Let's talk a little bit about intellectual intimacy. So this also takes longer to establish than physical intimacy. You don't need to have identical points of view to have intellectual intimacy in a marriage to sustain a great, vibrant relationship. It blossoms in a non-judgmental environment. So to have open-mindedness with each other, and beyond these ideas, we can discover a lot about people themselves, what we love, what drives us, what inspires us, what motivates our ideas and opinions. So instead of just hearing an idea and rejecting it, if it's different than yours, intellectual intimacy means, wow, like, that's really incredible that you think that way. It's very different from how I think and feel. Can you explain to me where that comes from in you and why you think you feel that way? Or why you have these motivations or inspirations? Where do you think that comes from? And you're able to share that with another person. Spiritual intimacy. This is the rarest form of intimacy and the most elusive. It's a respect. It's a reverence. You'll do everything for the other in their power to become the best version of themselves. You would never do anything to harm your beloved because, or cause him and her to become less than what he or she was created to be. And you have to provide the tools necessary to help each other grow in this virtue. I'll give you an example. Before my husband and I were married, I struggled with a lot of physical issues with intimacy. And after we were married, even though he was not Catholic, he wanted to follow the Catholic view as far as sexual intimacy and natural family planning. And because I had been so wounded in this area of my life, I thought that this meant my husband was not attracted to me because he didn't want to have sexual intercourse more often. And I really struggled with that. And he was like, no, I really want to protect your soul. And I don't want to allow us to fall into any kind of serious sin, even in the bonds of marriage when it comes to sexual intimacy. And because of that, I need to protect you. And actually, he was denying his own need for this physical intimacy in order to keep me safe and to keep me out of sin, which is a very beautiful surrender and such a wonderful example of spiritual intimacy, that he was willing to set that part of himself aside for me so that I can become more holy and I can become a better version of who I am to be, because part of his job is to get me into heaven, right? And so in that moment, I felt very safe with this person. Like, this person has my best interest at heart. And he wants me to be a virtuous person, and he wants to be a virtuous person, and I can trust him with these things. It makes all respectful relationships possible. For example, 2 patient people will have a better relationship than 2 impatient people. This virtue is a foundation of selflessness. As you grow in spiritual intimacy, your experience of others will grow as well. Each of us has each of the 4 forms of intimacy. So that's the physical, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual, has to contribute to our relationship. You have to have all 4. You cannot be lacking in one. You might struggle in one or 2. Talk about that with your partner. What are the ways that we struggle? Is physical intimacy something we struggle with? Or maybe we're really great at intellectual intimacy and we can tell each other everything, but we really struggle with emotional intimacy, being more vulnerable with each other. Physical intimacy is limited, so the other 3 are limitless. If you explore and develop them, you will experience upper reaches of physical intimacy. So you can have physical intimacy and it be great, but unless you really work on the emotional, spiritual, and intellectual side, then your physical intimacy can only go so far. Your physical intimacy will increase and be so much more joy-filled and fruitful if you increase in these other 3 ways. So in the beginning of a relationship, we must grow steadily in each of these 4 areas. And if we develop just one type very quickly and neglect the others, it can create an imbalance and a distortion in the relationship. And certainly I can think of a lot of examples early on in my marriage where that was true. Physical intimacy at first is wonderful, but then almost immediately it stunts the growth of the relationship. So you have to nurture the other 3. When we overvalue physical intimacy, we become preoccupied with it. So that happens in a lot of marriages I see, especially when people have children. If they've overemphasized the physical intimacy of their relationship and then suddenly they've had children early on, and they've neglected these other forms of intimacy, they kind of begin to judge and value the relationship as less than, because the physical intimacy is lacking. So obviously in seasons of marriage, you might not be able to be physically intimate for whatever reason. Sometimes when you have little kids, it's just sheer exhaustion, honestly. You just don't have the time and you don't feel close to that person. So it's very difficult. And then men struggle with that because they have that need. Women feel guilt. And then because they've overvalued the physical intimacy in their relationship, they think, oh my goodness, something's wrong with us, we need to get a divorce. Instead of working on those other forms in the meantime, so that they can be more physically intimate when they're able to be, in a joy-filled way. And not be forced or feel, coerced or stressed out about it, and to actually enjoy that time with your spouse. This can only be fully realized in the commitment of time. So the first step toward intimacy with others is intimacy with yourself. By that, I mean that you have to be comfortable with yourself and you have to know who you are. If you don't, you can always get a spiritual director to help you. I have a spiritual director and I also have a therapist. And I talk to them regularly and they really help me tap into who I am as a person so that I can get to know myself and be more intimate with myself and know who I am so that I can better serve my spouse. All right. And not have all this neediness for someone else. and that this intimacy focuses on my first and foremost my relationship with God. As long as my identity is based in that and not as, Andy's wife. I'm Andy's wife, but that's not who I am. I'm not just a mom. I'm not just Andy's wife. I'm not just the youth and young adult minister. I'm a daughter of God. And because of that, I'm able to be those other things for those other people. So physical intimacy on its own does not have what it takes to sustain any relationship. True intimacy is constantly rediscovering each other. So, this is not something that you just achieve and then everything is over. It's something that you're going to, work on throughout your marriage. So talk about intimacy with your spouse, talk about your strengths and weaknesses, and talk about different ideas that you could do to increase maybe one area of intimacy this year with your spouse. I hope that this was helpful to you. Have a great night. God bless.